So you just picked up the new Osmo Pocket 3 and you want to set it up to capture the absolute most color detail and maximize this new 1-inch sensor. And I'm going to show you how to set it up with the most cinematic settings possible. So the first thing we're going to do is set our resolution and frame rate. It comes at 1080 30 frames per second. So we're going to want to go ahead and change that to 4K as our resolution. And for frame rate, you can either do this at 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second. A lot of people do like to shoot at 24 frames per second, which isn't as many frames, but it looks a little bit smoother, a little more cinematic or movie-like. 30 frames per second is totally fine too. And then if you're shooting slow-mo, if you're gonna slow it down, either 60 frames per second or 50 frames per second if you're kind of going for that cinematic look as well. For the sake of this video, we're gonna be shooting at 4K 30 frames per second in order to maximize that 1-inch camera sensor. Next up, we're gonna go ahead and slide the screen over from the right and click on the Pro tab up there, and that's gonna unlock some more settings for you to adjust. So we're gonna start out with that top left box, the exposure M. We're gonna click on that, and that's gonna allow us to set our shutter speed as well as our ISO. So we're gonna set shutter speed at double our frame rate. So remember, our frame rate's 30 frames per second. So we wanna lock our shutter speed off at 1/60th. And as if you watch any of these videos, you already know that this is called the 180-degree rule of shutter. And at this frame rate to shutter speed ratio, where your shutter speed is double your frame rate, that is going to illustrate motion the same way we perceive it in real life, as in we blur motion. So when we see motion in real life, it's blurred, always blurred. The faster it's moving, the more it's blurred. So we're gonna set our shutter speed to 1/60th to double our frame rate of 30. And in here, we're gonna put ISO at 100. I would not go above 400 ISO. Stuff might get a little bit noisy on this camera, but between 100 and 400 is totally solid on this camera. So we're gonna have it at 100, and in these lighting conditions right here, that exposure is perfectly balanced. You can see on the top left is your EV meter, your exposure value. You're gonna want that to be either 0 or like plus 0.3, minus 0.3. You could even swing up to like plus 0.6, minus 0.6, and you might need to grade a little bit in post, but in that range, totally solid. So now when we take this camera outside, there's gonna be way more light entering into this system. So we are going to need to take one of these neutral density filters and install it in front of the camera in order to reduce light so we can lock that shutter speed off at 1/60th, which is double our frame rate. Now we've got two different styles of neutral density filter for you. We have the NDPLs, which is our Vivid collection, and these things are so small, it's crazy. But they magnetize right onto the front of the lens. And then we've got just the Shutter collection, which are just the NDs, and these are only gonna reduce the light entering the camera. The Vivid collection, the NDPL filters, are going to reduce the amount of light, but they're also gonna polarize the scene. So it's gonna just give you a little bit less reflections, which leaves behind deeper color saturation and also gives you a little bit more contrast. The next up is white balance. That's the setting in the top right. We're gonna go ahead and click on that. This is a little bit up to you. You can choose auto white balance, and that's gonna just adjust it for you as the lighting temperature changes in whatever scene you're in. The camera is totally capable of doing that, but if for some reason you wanna fully lock it off, you're gonna go ahead and click the M there, and that's gonna take you into manual mode, and then you'll be able to adjust the white balance up and down in Kelvin, and that's gonna be dependent on the temperature of the lighting. So like in here right now, 4,000 Kelvin is pretty much what we're working with, but if we go outdoors, the new light source is the sun, and that is usually between 5,000 and 5,600 Kelvin. So you're gonna have to be familiar with white balance, and it's gonna change depending on your light sources. So you do need to be comfortable with that if you move it into manual mode. General rule of thumb, I like to have it about 5,000, maybe 5,600 for sunrise, sunset outdoors. Indoors, 4,000 is usually pretty solid. Next up, glamour effects. These are actually pretty funny, but we're gonna go ahead and leave that off for now. And next up is the color setting, and we're gonna go ahead and click that 2 times, and that's gonna take us to the D-Log M setting, which is 10-bit, and that's gonna capture the absolute most color detail this camera possibly can. Now remember, this is gonna give you a very flat picture, flat color picture, so you will need to grade it in post. So if you're not into that, you probably don't care about cinematic camera settings, so don't even worry about switching it to D-Log-M. But if you're absolutely trying to get the most out of this camera, you do need it in D-Log-M 10-bit for the most color depth possible. Next up, focus mode. This is totally up to you, whatever you're shooting, whatever you want this focus to be. I'm gonna just leave it in continuous because it's easy, the camera's solid. Image adjustment, so you can get in custom here and adjust sharpness and also noise reduction. I like to just leave it at 0 and 0 and do the stuff in post. If you see you're liking anything, like you do actually want your image a little bit sharper and you want to bake it into camera, generally not recommended, but I'm just gonna leave it at 0 sharpness, 0 noise reduction, which is default, so you don't actually need to change anything. Just kind of wanted to explain that in this video. And that's it, you're all set up at that point. This thing's ready to go. Like I said, the only thing you're gonna notice if you are not comfortable with changing these settings or you haven't done them before is when you're shooting outdoors, you are going to need to monitor the amount of light entering the camera because we are locking off all of our exposure. We're locking shutter speed at double frame rate, 1/60th. We're locking ISO at 100 to 400. And then the aperture is locked at f2.0, so literally fully locked off. Now, if you put your filter on, so we've got 3 different levels of neutral density. There's an ND8 filter, an ND32 filter, and an ND128 filter. So if you need filters in between them, what you're actually going to be doing is putting on a darker ND filter and increasing your ISO by 1 stop. So from 100 to 200, or even from 200 to 400, anywhere in that range of ISO like 50 to 400 is totally fine, and that's an easy way to adjust your exposure without constantly having to install and remove neutral density filters. And if you have any questions on how to set up your new Pocket 3 camera, shoot them in the comments below. Happy to answer them. I'm Jeff with Polar Pro. We'll see you on the next one.